It's our last week together, class, and this is the last lecture for week 6. This week we covered chapter 15, which is psychological disorders, and chapter 16, which is treatments for psychological disorders. Let's get into it. The definition of a psychological disorder. This is a difficult one. First, psychologists look at psychopathology, the study of psychological disorders, including their symptoms, etiology, meaning causes, and treatment. So, a psychologist who is studying abnormal psychology is a psychopathologist. Okay? Their job is to study psychological disorders, their symptoms, their causes, and their treatments. Psychological disorder, however, is a condition characterized by abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, behaviors, thoughts, and inner experiences that are atypical, dysfunctional, or dangerous are signs of psychological disorders. However, there is no single definition of psychological abnormality or normality. Just because something is atypical does not mean it is disordered. For example, red hair is considered unusual, but not abnormal. You can't think Prince Harry or Isla Fisher from the great movie Wedding Crashers are or have a psychological disorder because they have something that's atypical, which is red hair. So it's difficult to distinguish abnormal and normal. And that's what made it very difficult if we look at abnormal psychology or psychopathology historically. Now, because we struggle to discover what's abnormal and what's normal, we look at the psychological disorder from a bunch of different perspectives. So we look at it using our cultural expectations. So violating cultural expectations is not enough by itself to identify a psychological disorder. Social norms vary between cultures. What is considered appropriate here in the U.S. may be viewed very differently in another culture. Hallucinations is a violation of cultural expectations here in Western society, in the U.S., right? If someone came up to you and said that they were hallucinating, you would probably have a sense of fear, danger, and immediately think this person needs to be in a hospital. People who report hallucinations are likely to be labeled, right? They're likely to be labeled crazy or schizophrenic. However, in other cultures, certain types of hallucinations are highly valued. In Eastern cultures, they put tons of expectations on those that have those. They still involve themselves and experience hallucinations. They want to. They think it's a sense of higher power or a calling if they can experience a hallucination. So it can be difficult to look at a psychological disorder from a cultural expectation side. So in 1992, Wakefield proposed a more influential concept in which he defined psychological disorders as a harmful dysfunction. The word dysfunction occurs when an internal mechanism, meaning your cognition, your perception, learning, breaks down and cannot perform its normal function. For a dysfunction to be classed as a disorder, it must also be harmful, meaning it leads to negative consequences for the individual or for others, as judged by the standards of the individual's culture. So, hallucinations in the Eastern part aren't harmful dysfunctions. They are enlightening. They are touted as well respected when you experience those things. Whereas here in our country, they are a harmful dysfunction. This then led the American Psychological Association, or APA, to define a psychological disorder as a condition that consists of the following: significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behavior outside of cultural norms. The disturbances reflect some kind of biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. And the disturbances lead to significant distress or disability in one's life. For example, difficulty performing appropriate and expected roles. Despite the many existing definitions, there is no universal agreement on what the boundary between disordered and not disordered is. So it may depend on where you are to determine exactly how you define normal and abnormal. One tool that helps us get here is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the DSM. This is going to be critical to you for question 1 as well as question 2 in chapter 15 questions. Diagnosis is defined as appropriately identifying and labeling a set of defined symptoms, which means that we need to classify our symptoms. We need classification systems that organize psychological disorders systematically, breaks down symptoms, labels each of them. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was published by the American Psychiatric Association, right? And it was first published in 1952 and has obviously since undergone numerous revisions. Why wouldn't you? The times they have changed. The first 2 editions of the DSM listed homosexuality as a disorder, and luckily was removed in 1973. The DSM-5 is the classification system used by most mental health professionals. And it categorizes and describes each disorder. What it does is it provides diagnostic features, so an overview of each of the disorders, diagnostic criteria, specific symptoms required in order to diagnose someone with this particular disorder. If those symptoms don't exist, then they can't fall into that diagnostic criteria. Prevalence, the percent of the population thought to be affected, and risk factors. It also provides information about comorbidity. This is when 2 disorders are more likely to occur together. The co-occurrence of 2 disorders. We're going to discover that much more deeper as we move forward. Now the prevalence rates. The graph shows the breakdown of psychological disorders comparing the percentage prevalence among adult males and adult females in the United States. So the DSM is really concentrated on the United States. The DSM-5 has since been, or the DSM-4 has since been supplanted by the DSM-5. Most categories remain the same. However, alcohol abuse now falls under a broader alcohol use disorder category. So you can see the DSM disorder listed at the bottom axis: major depressive disorder, alcohol abuse, specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, so on and so forth. And you can see the prevalence rates total, the prevalence rates for male and female, individually. And then comorbidity, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder and major depressive disorder. Those tend to frequently occur in the same person and have a 41% comorbidity, which means that someone who's diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder is 40% more likely to also have major depressive disorder. Pretty significant. Pretty significant. The second way that we might classify disorders or abnormal behavior is using the International Classification of Diseases. For question 2 in chapter 15, these are the 2 things I want you to be looking at and comparing for that question: the DSM and the ICD. What are their differences? What's more prevalent? What's more important? Okay? But the ICD was published by the World Health Organization, and classification and criteria for specific disorders are similar to the DSM, but some differences do exist. It's used to examine general health populations and monitor prevalence of diseases and health problems internationally. So it's not just looking at the US, it's looking at the entire globe. Worldwide, the ICD is more frequently used for clinical diagnosis. So this is used more clinically to diagnose on a worldwide basis, whereas the DSM is more valued for research purposes. Now, the DSM includes more explicit disorder criteria as well as extensive explanatory text, which could be helpful. The DSM is the classification system used among U.S. mental health professionals. Is there a positive of using something that's more prevalent to the U.S.? Or should we begin looking at things more internationally? Now, if we look back historical at some supernatural perspectives, for centuries, psychological disorders were viewed from a supernatural perspective. meaning that psychological disorders were attributed to a force beyond scientific understanding. Think practitioners of black magic, sorcery, possessed by spirits, and witchcraft. Those were the things that people kind of grouped together that are now actually what we now know as abnormal behavior. Back then, it was sorcery, witchcraft. Treatments back then also were very extreme. They included torture, beatings, and exorcism. In The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, a 15th century painting by Bosch, a practitioner is using a tool to extract an object, the supposed Stone of Madness, from the head of an affected person. Could you imagine living in that time? It seems wild to me. An epidemic in Western Europe from the 11th to the 17th century in which groups of people would suddenly begin to dance with wild abandon, known as dancing mania. Some would dance for days or weeks, screaming of terrible visions. Although the cause is unknown, the behavior was attributed by many to supernatural forces. I mean, in today's culture, dancing is great. Every other video on TikTok or Instagram is a dance. In the 11th to the 17th century, that would have been considered abnormal. We move then to biological perspectives. They view psychological disorders as linked to our biological phenomena, genetics, chemical imbalances, brain abnormalities. These are the things that have caused psychological disorders. This is supported by evidence that most psychological disorders have a genetic component. A person's risk of developing schizophrenia increases if a relative has schizophrenia. The closer the genetic relationship, the higher the risk. We often find this oftentimes. Your parents might disclose to you that you had a relative who had borderline personality disorder or something along those lines that makes you think, we should probably think about the genetic background to psychological disorders. You can see here that generation population, if you're an identical twin, luckily I'm not, I have 100% gene shareage with that person. If they have schizophrenia, I would 100% likely have schizophrenia as well too. Now, it can't just be about our biology. It also has to be about our environment. Thus came the psychosocial perspective. This emphasizes the importance of learning, stress, faulty and self-defeated thinking patterns, and environmental factors. Views the cause of psychological disorders as a combination of the biological and the psychosocial factors. Thus then created the diathesis stress model. This integrates biological and psychosocial factors to predict the likelihood of a disorder. People with an underlying predisposition for disorder, diathesis, are more likely than others to develop a disorder when faced with adverse environmental or psychological events. A diathesis can be a biological or psychological vulnerability. This particular slide is going to be critical to you when it comes to answering question 4 in chapter 15. It's talking to you and asking you about how someone could become a revered businessman or politician when another person could become a psycho killer. Could it potentially have something to do with this particular model? I then want to move in. We're going to move into each of the categories. I might go fairly quickly through some of these. I want you to read through them to understand them on your own, potentially. Okay? So first we want to look at anxiety disorders. In order for these to be classified and defined, we had to evaluate fear versus anxiety. Fear is an instantaneous reaction to an imminent threat. You see someone with a gun, you experience fear, it causes you to run in the opposite direction. Anxiety, however, is apprehension, avoidance, cautiousness regarding a potential threat, not an imminent one, danger, or other negative content. Think about potential. Anxiety motivates us to take action and avoid certain things. And the level and duration of anxiety usually matches the magnitude of the potential threat. However, some people experience anxiety that is excessive, persistent, and out of proportion with the actual threat. So anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive and persistent fear and anxiety, and by related disturbances and behavior. The prevalence affects approximately 25% to 30% of the U.S. population during their lifetime. It is more common in women than men, and it's most frequently occurring class of mental disorders. It is the most frequently occurring class of mental disorders. Now, a specific phobia, which is within the anxiety disorder, involves excessive, distressing, and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation. People may realize their fear and anxiety is irrational, but still go to great lengths to avoid the stimulus. The prevalence is that it affects 12.5% of the U.S. population at some point in their lifetime. Now, common specific phobias include agoraphobia, which is heights, aerophobia, which is flying, arachnophobia is spiders, and claustrophobia, which is enclosed spaces. Those are the 4 top ones. And if we look at agoraphobia, this is listed as a separate anxiety disorder. This particular phobia is characterized by intense fear, anxiety, and avoidance of situations in which it might be difficult to escape or receive help if one experiences a panic attack. These situations include public transportation, crowds, and being outside of the home alone. So many agoraphobics will actually be shut-ins. They'll remain in their homes. They won't leave their homes for fear of panic attacks or could develop and they can't escape. So they just remain safely in their homes. Now, how do we get there? What causes a phobia? Many believe that there was an acquisition of phobias through learning, right? So we go back to classical conditioning. In 1977, there were 3 major learning pathways when it came to phobias. First is classical conditioning. For example, a child is bitten by a dog. That's the unconditioned stimulus. The dog becomes associated with biting. Now that's a conditioned stimulus. The dog is now conditioned to always bite or be a biter. The child then experiences fear around dogs, the conditioned response. Conditioned fears develop more readily to fear-relevant stimuli, images of snakes and spiders, than to fear-irrelevant stimuli, images of flowers, for example. Meaning that a conditioned fear develops quicker and more easily when there's already a fear-relevant stimuli, a dangerous stimuli, something that could be harmful. Whereas flowers don't tend to create a lot of fear in someone, even if something bad doesn't happen. Second is vicarious learning. A child observes a cousin react with fear around spiders. The child later expresses the same fears, even though spiders have never presented any real danger to them. So vicarious learning is the second particular major pathway. And 3, verbal transmission of information. A child is continuously told that snakes are dangerous. The child then starts to fear snakes, right? How many of you ever listened to your parents when they said you're not allowed to swim after eating food or you'll drown? You might have become fearful of swimming in a pool after eating, even though you had never faced that danger before, nor had you ever probably seen it. Now the question is why are certain types of phobias more common than others? One theory argues that because our ancestors associated certain stimuli with danger, snakes, spiders, heights, things like that, we are evolutionarily predisposed to associate those stimuli with fear. So think about the evolutionary process. Think about our ancestors who didn't have the ways to fight back against simple diseases that we do now. That can cause an evolutionary predisposition to phobias. Social anxiety disorder is characterized by extreme and persistent fear or anxiety and avoidance of social situations, in which the person could potentially be evaluated negatively by others, leading to serious impairments in life. This ends up being associated with lower educational attainment, lower earnings, poor work performance, and unemployment. Many people engage in what's called safety behaviors, mental or behavioral acts that reduce their anxiety in social situations by reducing the chance of negative social outcomes. They might avoid eye contact or rehearse sentences before speaking, using sort of an internal filter, so to speak. Some people might hold something in their pocket. Fidget spinners were a big thing that became safety behaviors in order to decrease social anxiety disorders. Having something to hang on to in your hands to sort of distract you from being in a social setting. This is experienced by about 12% of Americans during their lifetime. And it does have a comorbidity. It has a high rate of comorbidity with alcohol use disorders. Individuals may self-medicate to reduce anxiety in social situations. They think, I'm less anxious in social settings if I'm drunk or high or utilizing pills in order to get through that experience. So then they become dependent upon those. And they need to have them, which then creates an alcohol use disorder. Now, some of the risk factors. Fears of social situations possibly develop through conditioning. 92% of a sample of adults with social anxiety disorder reported a history of severe teasing in childhood. So, if that happens when you're younger, then that's a risk factor for potentially becoming or experiencing social anxiety disorder later in life. Behavioral inhibition is a consistent tendency to show fear and restraint when presented with unfamiliar people or situations. Another risk factor. Panic disorder is a recurrent and unexpected panic attacks, along with at least 1 month of persistent concern about additional panic attacks, worry over the consequence of the attacks, or self-defeating changes in behavior related to the attacks. Comorbidity for panic disorders is anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. So someone who has panic attack disorder is likely going to also have anxiety disorder of some kind or a major depressive disorder. A panic attack is a period of extreme fear or discomfort that develops abruptly and reaches a peak within 10 minutes. It can be expected in response to an external trigger or unexpected, so there's really no way to tell. Panic attacks alone are not a disorder. If it's recurrent and unexpected, with at least 1 month of persistent concern about additional panic attacks, meaning worry over the then it can be classified as panic disorder. But a panic attack where you have maybe like one a year or like one every 2 years, not to be labeled panic disorder. Some of the physical manifestations of a panic attack are shown here in this graphic. Feeling dizzy and unsteady and lightheaded. You might experience chest pains, palpitations, or accelerated heart rate. You might feel nauseous or have abdominal stress. Shortness of breath in the lungs. People may also experience sweating, trembling, feelings of faintness, or a fear of losing control, among other symptoms. Oftentimes, people who are having panic attacks believe that they're having heart attacks because of the experience what they experience in their body when having a panic attack. Some of the causes are genetics. So if we think about what the causes could be for panic disorder, 43% of it is heritability, meaning that 43% of people with panic disorder is coming from their genes, meaning one of their relatives, close relatives, had it. The neurobiological theory, so this is also still a form of nature, is in the locus coeruleus in the brainstem, major source of norepinephrine. This is a neurotransmitter that triggers our fight or flight response. Activation is associated with anxiety and fear and produces panic-like symptoms in non-human primates. So there's a possibility that a part of our brains are actually involved here. There could potentially be an abnormality with that area of the brain that causes them to have panic disorder. Conditioning theories. Panic attacks are classical conditioning responses to subtle bodily sensations resembling those normally occurring when one is anxious or frightened. And cognitive theories. Individuals with panic disorder are prone to interpret ordinarily bodily sensations catastrophically, setting the state for panic attacks. For example, in some patients, reducing catastrophic cognitions about sensations have proven to be effective as effective as medication in reducing panic attacks. Meaning that, say someone has catastrophic cognitive thinking and they start to experience like heart palpitations. Very minimal heart palpitations, not a big deal. But because they have catastrophic thinking, they think, oh my God, what is this heart palpitation? I'm going to die. Everything's going to crap. And then the panic attack is set off very easily. So The theory is to attack the catastrophic thinking, thus limiting the panic disorder. Now, generalized anxiety disorder is a relatively continuous state of excessive, uncontrollable, and pointless worry and apprehension. The diagnosis criteria is the diffuse worrying and apprehension is not part of another disorder. Symptoms occur more days than not for at least 6 months, and symptoms are accompanied by any of the 3 following symptoms: restlessness, difficulty concentrating, being easily fatigued, muscle tension, irritability, and sleep difficulties. This affects about 5.7% of the U.S. population during their lifetime, and females are 2 times as likely as males to experience the disorder. And it's comorbid with mood disorders and other anxiety disorders. Some of the causes: there are cognitive theories around the cause for generalized anxiety disorder. Worry represents a mental strategy to avoid more powerful negative emotions, perhaps stemming from earlier unpleasant or traumatic experiences, meaning that someone ends up with generalized anxiety disorder because the worry is actually a way to distract them from fear or past trauma. It ends up putting them in a state of constant worry, which then leads to generalized anxiety disorder. Worrying acts as a distraction from remembering painful childhood experiences. A longitudinal study found childhood maltreatment was strongly related to development of the disorder during adulthood. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder involves thoughts and urges that are intrusive, unwanted, these are obsessions, and or the need to engage in repetitive behaviors or mental acts, these are compulsions. So obsessions are persistent, unintentional, and unwanted thoughts and urges that are highly intrusive, unpleasant, and distressing. So common obsessions are things like concerns about germs and contamination, doubts, order and symmetry, aggressive or lustful urges. Concerns about germs and contamination was a really big thing in the last 2 years. People thought they were obsessive compulsive when they really may not have been. It could have just been because of what we were living through in a pandemic. So it made it difficult. Now, compulsions are repetitive and ritualistic acts, typically carried out primarily as a means to minimize the distress that obsessions trigger, or to reduce the likelihood of a feared event. So someone who's concerned about germs and contamination may wash their hands 4 times every time they wash their hands. And they might have to use a new bar of soap each one of those 4 times. These things are not performed out of pleasure. They don't do it because it brings them great joy. The person usually knows these obsessions and compulsions are irrational, but suppressing them is extremely difficult. This is experienced by approximately 2.3% of the U.S. population in their lifetime. So as an example, I mentioned repetitive hand washing. Checking that the door is locked are common compulsions among those with obsessive compulsive disorder. Other common compulsions include cleaning, ordering, and counting. Ordering meaning putting things in order, right? They might have their books all lined up in order alphabetically. There needs to be some systematic order to their books on their bookshelf. Now, body dysmorphic disorder involves a preoccupation with a perceived flaw in the individual's physical appearance that is either non-existent or barely noticeable to other people. This causes a person to think that they are unattractive or deformed. Typically involves skin, face, or hair, but can focus on any bodily area. This causes a person to engage in repetitive and ritualistic behavior and mental acts that will constantly be looking in the mirror, trying to hide the offending body part, comparison with others, and they may engage in cosmetic surgery over and over and over again in order to obtain what is probably likely unattainable. It affects approximately 2.4% of adults in the U.S., with slightly higher rates in women than in men. Are we seeing a trend here? Many of these psychological disorders have a higher rate in women than men thus far. Hoarding disorder. This involves great difficulty in discarding possessions. Many of you might think, oh my God, my parents are such hoarders. They keep everything. See this image in this photo? If your parents' homes don't look like that, you're safe. regardless of how valueless, useless they are, usually resulting in accumulation of items that clutter the living or work areas. Why are they unable to let go of items? They think items might be useful at a later time. I can't use this right now, but I'll definitely be able to use it sometime, so I've got to keep it. And they have a sentimental attachment to items. They might hang on to something because their best friend touched it and they think something's going to happen to their best friend. So it could literally be trash, but they have to save it. Excessive clutter prevents the individual using necessary living spaces such as the kitchen or the bed. Bathrooms become overrun. Bathing becomes difficult. And it's diagnosed as long as the hoarding is not a symptom of another disorder. Meaning, are they hoarding as a symptom of agoraphobia? It's not technically hoarding disorder if they're also agoraphobic. If they leave the house and they're fine leaving the house, then they may have hoarding disorder. But if they're constantly staying and remaining in the home and just keeping all their belongings, then the agoraphobia is the disorder that actually is more prevalent. It needs to be primary. Now, when looking at obsessive compulsive disorder, if we go back, we look at the genetics. 5 times more frequent in first-degree relatives of people with OCD. 57% concordance rate for identical twins, 22% concordance rate for fraternal twins. Genes involved regulate the function of serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate. So there's a possible gene linkage here when it comes to OCD. Now, the conditioning theories, symptoms of OCD, are learned responses resulting from both classical and operant conditioning. So neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus causes anxiety or distress. So once association has been acquired, encounters with the NS, the neutral stimulus, trigger anxiety and obsessive thoughts. Anxiety and obsessive thoughts continue until a strategy is identified to relieve it. And relief may be realistic behavior or mental activity that reduces that anxiety. And then those compulsive acts become negatively reinforcing. Some psychologists have also found that brain anatomy is involved in OCD. They have the OCD circuit, several interconnected regions that influence perceived emotional value of stimuli and selection of behavioral and cognitive responses. Abnormalities in these areas may produce symptoms of OCD. They're looking primarily at the orbitofrontal cortex. That's that front part of the brain right behind your forehead. This is involved in learning and making decisions. Becomes hyperactive when people with OCD, when provoked with tasks such as looking at photos of a toilet or at pictures hanging crookedly on a wall. Now if we move into the definition of PTSD. So this is post-traumatic stress disorder. Individuals was exposed to, witnessed, or experienced the details of a traumatic experience. So actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence is the definition in the APA. PTSD was first recognized in soldiers who had engaged in combat. And the symptoms of PTSD must occur for at least 1 month in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. Some of the symptoms include intrusive and distressing memories of the event, flashbacks, states during which individuals relive the events and behaves as if they were occurring at that moment, avoidance of stimuli connected to the event, persistently negative emotional states, feelings of detachment from others, irritability, proneness towards outbursts, and exaggerated startle response. This is experienced by approximately 7% of the U.S. population in their lifetime. Some of the risk factors, if they experience a trauma. Those involving harm by others carry greater risk than those that do not. Lack of immediate social support. So if they don't have social support, comfort, advice, and assistance from relatives, friends, and neighbors, that can reduce the risk of developing PTSD. If they have subsequent life stress following the traumatic event. If they're female, low socioeconomic status, low intelligence, personal history of mental disorders, history of childhood adversity, family history of mental disorders, personality characteristics, neuroticism and somatization, tendency to experience physical symptoms when one encounters stress, possession of 1 or 2 short versions of a gene that regulates serotonin, tons of risk factors, some genetic, right? The possession of one or two short versions of a gene that regulates serotonin, but also some environmental, right? Low socioeconomic status, for example. Learning and the development of PTSD. So there are conditioning theories behind PTSD that state that traumatic events, so this is the unconditioned stimulus, results in extreme fear and anxiety, the unconditioned response. Cognitive, emotional, physiological, and environmental cues associated with the traumatic event become conditioned stimuli, meaning that if they experience any of those cues, environmental cues, loud noises, booms, that then automatically results in the extreme fear and anxiety. That conditioned response exposes it again. Two key processes in development and maintenance of PTSD, if you're thinking at it from a cognitive perspective, is one, disturbances in memory for the event. Poorly encoded memories of a trauma can become fragmented, disorganized, and lacking in detail. Individuals cannot remember event in a way that gives meaning and context. They may become haunted by these fragments, involuntarily triggered by stimuli associated with the event. Two is negative appraisals of the trauma and its aftermath. I deserve to be raped because I am stupid. May lead to dysfunctional behavior patterns that maintain symptoms and prevent changes in problematic appraisals. People are going to continue to have PTSD symptoms if they are continually to negatively think about the trauma and its aftermath. This happened to me because I let it. I caused it. Now, mood disorders. This is characterized by massive disruptions of mood and emotions that can cause a distorted outlook on life and impair your ability to function. There are two types of mood disorders. You have depressive disorders, so this is things like depression. Intense and persistent sadness is the main feature, obviously. And then you have bipolar and related disorders. So you have mania, which is extreme elation and agitation, and a manic episode, a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy lasting at least 1 week. So now if we break down mood disorders, we've got major depressive disorder. The diagnosis criteria for major depressive disorder is a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Loss of interest in pleasure and usual activities. At least 5 symptoms for at least a 2-week period. Symptoms cause significant distress or impair normal functioning and are not caused by substances or a medical condition. So you can't have any other medical conditions or be using other substances. Major depressive disorder is episodic, meaning that symptoms are usually present at their full magnitude for a certain period of time and then gradually diminish. People might say that they're experiencing a depressive episode. That's what they're talking about. They had a period of intense depression and then they came through it. Some of the symptoms are weight loss or weight gain, increased or decreased appetite, difficulty falling asleep or too much sleep, psychomotor agitation or psychomotor retardation, fatigue, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty concentrating, indecisiveness, suicidal ideation, meaning thoughts of death, thinking about / planning suicide, or the suicide attempt. The prevalence is that it affects around 6.6% of the U.S. population each year and 16.9% of the U.S. population in their lifetime. More common among women than men, once again. And it's comorbid with anxiety disorders and substance abuse disorders. Risk factors include unemployment, low income, living in urban areas, being separated, divorced, or widowed. Now, there are subtypes of depression. So you've got major depressive disorder, but then you've got these subtypes. So seasonal pattern depression, also known as seasonal affective disorder, and the acronym for that is SAD, very appropriate, applies to a situation in which a person experiences the symptoms of major depressive disorder only during a particular time of year. Think about it. Summer is great. We're all happy. happy-go-lucky, we're outside, we're with our friends, we're going to concerts, we're living large in the summer. But then it starts to get a little bit colder and a little bit colder, and by January and February, we are home, we're going nowhere. It's dark early, the sun isn't shining as long during the day, so that can create what's called seasonal pattern depression, or seasonal affective disorder. There's also peripartum onset, which is postpartum depression. This is major depression during pregnancy or in the 4 weeks following the birth. So this is experienced mostly by women, obviously, because they're the only ones that give birth. Then you have persistent depressive disorder, or dysthymia. These are depressed moods most of the day, nearly every day for at least 2 years, as well as at least 2 years of the other symptoms of major depression. Chronically sad, but do not meet the criteria for major depressive disorder. Now, bipolar disorder, the other category of mood disorders, involves mood states that fluctuate between depression and mania. So you've got the symptoms of mania, which is excessive talking, excessively irritable. They exhibit a flight of ideas, talking loudly and rapidly, abruptly switching from one topic to another. They can become easily distracted. They can also exhibit grandiosity, inflated but unjustified self-esteem and self-confidence. They show little need for sleep, they take on several tasks at once, and they engage in reckless behaviors. The prevalence of this is the onset is typically before the age of 25 and affects 1 out of every 100 people in the U.S. in their lifetime. And 36% of these individuals attempt suicide. I should have mentioned that this particular lecture may mention suicide often. I'm going to hopefully not cover it too much, and I apologize if any of you have ever been affected by a suicide in your lives. It's incredibly sad. Now, comorbidities for bipolar disorders, anxiety disorder, and substance abuse disorder are likely seen with people who have bipolar disorder. Now, the biological basis of mood disorders, if we look at it genetically, when it comes to major depressive disorder, relatives have double the risk of developing major depressive disorder. And if you look at it using a twin study, identical twins have a 50% concordance rate. If one twin has major depressive disorder, it's 50% likely that the other twin will too. In fraternal twins, where they do not share 100% of their DNA, they're just as similar as siblings, there's a 38% concordance rate. And for bipolar disorder, relatives have over 9 times the risk. So if one identical twin has bipolar disorder, 67% of the time the other twin will too. And in fraternal twins or siblings, 16% of the time. Now, hormones. Elevated levels of cortisol, this is your stress hormone, are found in depression. So here's another biological basis for mood disorders. If you're someone who has chronic elevated levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, then you may likely have major depressive disorder. Now, the cause or consequence of depression, a risk factor for future depression. Cortisol activates the amygdala and deactivates the prefrontal cortex. And these are disturbances that are also connected with depression. So your brain and your hormone levels are very much connected there. Because there's a strong biological basis of mood disorders, then there was a huge movement for neurotransmitter medication, right? Mood disorders often involve imbalances in the neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters are involved in bodily functions that are disrupted in mood disorders. So many medications were designed to treat mood disorders, to work by altering their neurotransmitter activity in the neural synapse. Medications for depression usually increase serotonin and norepinephrine activity. And medications for bipolar, things like lithium, which block norepinephrine activity in the synapse. You'll learn more about these medications in chapter 16. Now, the biological basis of mood disorders. Think about brain anatomy as well, too. We just mentioned that the amygdala is an important assessing of the emotional significance of a stimuli and experiencing emotion. Depressed individuals react to negative emotional stimuli, such as sad faces, with greater amygdala activation than do non-depressed individuals. They're more prone to react emotionally to negative stimuli. They also found that the prefrontal cortex is important in regulating and controlling our emotions. Decreased activation in depressed individuals, which may inhibit its ability to override negative emotions. Greater difficulty in controlling their emotional reactions. So tons of brain activity occurring in mood disorders, specifically with depression. And if we look back at that diesthesis stress model in major depressive disorders to think about environmental factors, stressful life events often precede the onset of depressive episodes. However, not everyone who experiences stressful life events develop depression. Suggesting predispositions or vulnerability factors could be involved. So if someone has a genetic vulnerability, meaning that they have a particular alteration in one of their genes that regulates their serotonin, plus a stressful life event, this could increase the likelihood for them to experience a depressive episode. Now, if we look at the cognitive theories of depression, these suggest that depression is triggered by negative thoughts, interpretations, self-evaluations, and expectations. So if we go back to the diesthesis stress model, cognitive vulnerability, meaning someone who is already kind of a negative Nelly, a Debbie Downer, as they say, who then experiences a stressful life event, could potentially increase their likelihood of experiencing depression. Aaron Beck in the 1960s theorized that depression-prone people possess mental predispositions to think about most things in a negative way. They called these depressive schemas. They contain themes of loss, failure, rejection, worthlessness, and inadequacy. We call them pessimists or cynics. But in actuality, they're experiencing a depressive schema. And may develop in childhood in response to adverse experiences. They may lay dormant until activated by a stressful or negative life event, like being fired. They prompt dysfunctional and pessimistic thoughts about the self-worth and the future, maintained by cognitive biases which led us to focus on negative aspects of experiences and interpret things negatively and block positive memories. They don't remember the good things. They only remember the bad. And this led to the development of cognitive therapies for those who have depression. There's also the hopelessness theory. Specific negative thinking leads to a sense of helplessness, which creates depression. Negative thinking refers to a tendency to perceive negative life events as having stable, it's never going to change, and global, it's going to affect my whole life causes. So it creates a view that the life event will have negative implications for the person's future and self-worth, increasing the likeliness of hopelessness. And hopelessness is the expectation that unpleasant outcomes will occur or desired outcomes will not occur, and there's nothing one can do to prevent such outcomes, which is seen as the primary cause of depression. Then rumination is when a distressed mood causes rumination, meaning thinking, repetitive focus, which then increases the risk and duration of that mood. So if repetitive and passive focus on the fact that one is depressed and dwelling on depressed symptoms, meaning I can't get out of this bed, constantly dwelling on not being able to perform and go to work or school, rather than distracting oneself from the symptoms or attempting to address them in an active problem-solving manner. This described to explain higher rates of depression in women who are more likely to ruminate than men. Women tend to overthink. I'm going to skip these statistics on suicide. They're very troubling for me to go over. None of your questions focus on this, so I don't think that you'll be hindered by me not focusing on that. I'd like to move forward to talk about schizophrenia. Hallucinations are defined as perceptual experiences that occurs in the absence of external stimulation. So think auditory hallucinations are most common. People hear things, right? They're more likely to hear thoughts and hallucinations than they are to actually see these hallucinations. Now, delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality. So someone with schizophrenia might experience paranoid delusions, a belief that other people or agencies are plotting to harm them. Grandiose delusions, belief that one holds special power, unique knowledge, or is extremely important. Somatic delusions, belief that something highly abnormal is happening to one's body. This is where some schizophrenics might say that they believe that they're being inhabited by aliens. And they might have thought withdrawal or insertion. They also experience disorganized thinking, disjointed in an incoherent thought process. Disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, so unusual behaviors, movements, catatonic behaviors, decreased reactivity to the environment. And negative symptoms. Now, negative symptoms aren't necessarily bad symptoms. It's a decrease in absence in certain behaviors, emotions, or drives. So negative is meaning to remove something, similar to the way when we talked about positive and negative punishment and reinforcement. Negative meaning to just remove and take away. So avolition is a lack of motivation to engage in self-initiated and meaningful activity. Alogia is reduced speech output, so they might not speak a lot. Asociality is social withdrawal, and anhedonia is inability to experience pleasure. Some of the causes. Now, schizophrenia affects about 1% of the population, so it's not incredibly prevalent like the others. But the genetics. Risk is 6 times greater if one parent has schizophrenia, even if adopted. Okay. Then now for neurotransmitter causes, the dopamine hypothesis. An overabundance of dopamine or too many dopamine receptors are responsible for the onset and maintenance of schizophrenia. So drugs that increase dopamine levels can produce schizophrenia-like symptoms. Those with Parkinson's disease, this is kind of an interesting fact. Those with Parkinson's is a reduced amount of dopamine, causes Parkinson's. So the treatment for Parkinson's is drugs that increase dopamine levels. But sometimes, depending upon the levels of dopamine that they're taking in order to decrease their Parkinson's symptoms, they could actually start to inhibit or showcase schizophrenia symptoms because of this. Now, medications that block dopamine activity reduce the symptoms. So high levels of dopamine in the limbic system creates hallucinations and delusions, and low levels of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex are negative symptoms. Now, the brain anatomy. So if someone has enlarged ventricles, that could cause schizophrenia. If they have a reduced gray matter in the frontal lobes, and many show less frontal lobe activity when performing cognitive tasks. Now, events during pregnancy. If there's obstetric complications during birth, the mother's exposure to influenza during the first trimester, and mother's emotional stress, those 3 things during pregnancy could potentially result in the baby getting schizophrenia. Now, dissociative disorders are characterized by an individual becoming split off or dissociative from their core sense of self. Memory and identity become disturbed. You have 3 different types of dissociative disorders. You have dissociative amnesia, the inability to recall important personal information. This usually follows a stressful or traumatic experiences, things like dissociative fugue states. Individually suddenly wanders away from home, experiences confusion about their identity, and in some cases may adopt a new identity altogether. You then have depersonalization or derealization disorder. This is characterized by recurring episodes of depersonalization, derealization, or both. And then depersonalization is defined as feelings of unreality or detached from, unfamiliar with one's whole self or from aspects of the self. Now, derealization is a sense of unreality or detachment from an unfamiliarity with the world, be it individuals, inanimate objects, or all surroundings. Now, dissociative identity disorder you are all probably familiar with because it was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. This is when an individual exhibits 2 or more separate personalities or identity. Involves memory gaps for the time during which another identity is in charge. Individuals tend to report a history of childhood trauma. Adoption of multiple personalities may serve as a psychologically important coping mechanism for threat and danger. They leave their body, in essence, and someone else takes over so that they don't have to continue to experience the stress or the trauma. It can be a lot. Now, personality disorders are characterized by a pervasive and inflexible personality style, It differs markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture and causes distress or impairment. Question 3 for Chapter 15 is around personality disorders and why it might be difficult for someone with a personality disorder to seek treatment. It's important to think about that they are inflexible. Okay? They don't have, and it starts early in adolescence or early adulthood. And depending upon the cluster that they're in, it can potentially cause significant disruptions to their lives. It's slightly over 9% of the U.S. population suffers from personality development, or personality disorder, And avoidant and schizoid personality disorders are most frequent, and antisocial and borderline personality disorder are the most problematic. So if we look at borderline personality disorder, being that it's the most problematic, this is characterized by instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and mood, as well as marked impulsivity. So their symptoms: they cannot tolerate the thought of being alone, will make frantic efforts to avoid abandonment or separation. Relationships are often intense and unstable. And they have an unstable view of self, might suddenly display a shift in personal attitudes, interests, career plans, and choice of friends. Because they're constantly unstable, it makes it so difficult to sort of sit them down and say, you need help. Okay? The prevalence is that it affects 1.4% of the U.S. population, and it's likely comorbid with anxiety, mood, and substance use disorders. So it comes with a lot of baggage, oftentimes. Some of the causes is the core personality traits such as impulsivity and emotional instability show a high degree of heritability. Many individuals report a childhood abuse. So you have a genetic link with heritability, but then you also have an environmental link with childhood abuse. And if we look at antisocial personality disorder, it's characterized by a complete lack of regard for other people's rights or feelings. They oftentimes repeatedly perform illegal acts. They lie to or con others. They are impulsive and reckless. They're irritable and aggressive. They fail to act in responsible ways, lack of remorse. They have an overinflated sense of self and superficial charm. And they have the inability to empathize. Diagnosis requires individuals to be at least 18 years old. And the prevalence is that is observed in 3.7% of the populations. Now, this one, however, is more common in males. Finally, right? And you can see that you have some risk factors during adolescence that predict later violence. Now, some of the causes of antisocial personality disorder, if you look at genetics, personality and temperament dimensions related to this disorder: fearlessness, impulsive, antisociality, and callousness have a genetic influence. Adoption studies suggested that antisocial behavior is determined by the interaction of genetic factors and adverse environmental circumstances. Now, emotional deficits. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder fail to show fear in response to environment cues that signal punishment, pain, or noxious stimulation. And they show less skin conductance, which may indicate emotional deficits. Research has revealed less activation in brain regions involved in the expressions of empathy and feeling concern for others. Greater activation in a brain area involved in self-awareness, cognitive function, and interpersonal experience. Now, if we look at ADHD, these are neurodevelopmental disorders involved in... So first, before we can define ADHD, we have to define neurodevelopmental disorders. This involves developmental problems in personal, social, academic, and intellectual function. ADHD is defined as a constant pattern of inattention and or hyperactive and impulsive behavior that interferes with normal functioning. So then we break the symptoms down. You have symptoms of inattention and symptoms of hyperactivity. So things like disorganization and the inattention side, and then symptoms of blurting out responses before questions have been completed in hyperactivity. Prevalence is that it occurs in about 5% of children, and boys are 3 times more likely to have ADHD than girls. And some of the life problems is low educational attainment, low socioeconomic status, unemployment, low wages, substance abuse problems, and relationship problems. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act is thwarting this to say that they can still perform at as high of a level as anybody else. Now, causes. Inattention is 71% heritable, meaning that if your mother and father both have the inattention gene, then you are 71% is likely to have it. 73% heritable for the hyperactivity. Now, neurotransmitters. Dopamine, once again, could potentially affect your genes. Genes involved are thought to include at least 2 that are important in the regulation of dopamine. Individuals with ADHD show less dopamine activity in key brain regions, especially those associated with motivation and reward. Medications have stimulant qualities and elevate your dopamine activity. Your brain anatomy. Students show smaller frontal lobe volume and less activation when performing mental tasks. And frontal lobe inhibits behavior. This may explain hyperactive uncontrolled behavior of ADHD. And then you have the autism spectrum disorder. Deficits in social interaction, do not make eye contact, turn head away when spoken to, prefer playing alone. And then deficits in communication, one-word responses, difficulty maintaining conversation, echoed speech, and problems using and understanding nonverbal cues. This is repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. And the prevalence that it affects approximately 1 in 88 children in the U.S., and it's 5 times more common in boys. The causes are in genetics. Identical twins are 60 to 90% concordance rates, and fraternal twins are 5 to 10%. So genes involved are those important in the formation of synaptic circuits that facilitate communication between different areas of the brain. And then environment, factors that contribute to new mutations. Think of pollutants. Now, much has been said around child vaccines and the autism spectrum disorder, and all of it is not true. There is no vaccine that could cause autism spectrum disorder, okay? And here's some of the research behind it. So that's chapter 15. Now, 16. Therapy and treatment. So we just covered psychological disorders. But how do we treat those things? Many forms of therapy have been developed to treat a wide array of problems. Here in this photo, these Marines who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, together with community mental health volunteers, are part of the Ocean Therapy Program at Camp Pendleton, a program in which learning to surf is combined with group discussions. This program helps vets recover, especially vets who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. This is going to be a little clue to one of your questions that we'll go through. Now, these particular chapter questions are going to be a combination of the slides as well as your text. The first 2 questions for this chapter have some stuff in the slides, but your text is going to be a lot more informative. Section 16.2 in the text is going to help you answer questions 1 and 2. Okay? Good. Now, approximately 19% of U.S. adults and 13% of adolescents age 18 to 15 experience mental health illness in a given year, right? The percentage of adults who receive mental health treatment in 2004 to 2008 is shown below. Adults seeking treatment increased slightly from 2004 to 2008. Slightly. About 1/3 to 1/2 of U.S. adolescents with mental disorders receive treatment. And behavior-related disorders are more likely to be treated, right? So the ADHDs, the autism spectrum, behavior-related disorders are more likely to be treated because they're found in schools. Now, approximately 19% of U.S. adults and 13% of adolescents experience mental health, right, in a given year, like we said. So here's the breakdown of U.S. child mental health treatment, ages 8 to 15. More prevalently for ADHD or conduct disorders. Far less for anxiety disorders in ages 8 to 15. Now, in the past, treatment was thought of the same way abnormal psychology was thought of. Mental illness was believed to be caused by supernatural forces. People with mental illnesses at this time were often subjected to cruel and poor treatment. Think exorcisms. This involved incantations and prayers said over the individual's bodies by a priest or religious figure. Trephining was when a hole was made in the skull to release spirits from the body, which oftentimes, as you would imagine, led to their death. And then execution or imprisonment. Many mentally ill people were burned at the stake after being accused of witchcraft. Salem witch trials was a very, very poor way to treat those that could have potentially had a mental health issue. So in the 14th century, by the 18th century, people exhibiting unusual behavior began to be institutionalized. And this is when you began to see asylums. First institutions created for the specific purpose of housing people with psychological disorders. And the focus was ostracizing them from society rather than treatment, separating them from those that were not abnormal. Individuals were often kept in windowless dungeons, chained to beds, little to no contact with caregivers. The painting by Francisco Goya is called The Madhouse and depicts a mental asylum and its inhabitants in the early 1800s. It portrays those with psychological disorders as victims. And then Philippe Pinel in the late 1700s was a French physician. He argued for more humane treatment of the mentally ill, suggested that they be unchained and spoken to. This was implemented in Paris in 1975. And patients benefited, and many were able to be released from the hospital. Here you see a painting by Tony Robert Fleury depicts Dr. Philippe Pinel ordering the removal of chains from patients at the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris. Now, in the 19th century, Dorothea Dix, a social reformer who became an advocate for the indignant insane, she investigated the state of care for the mentally ill and poor, discovered an undefined, underfunded, and unregulated system that perpetuated abuse of the mentally ill. And she was instrumental in creating the first American mental asylum by relentlessly lobbying state legislators and Congress to set up and fund such institutions. Hear, Dorothea Dix. So in the 19th century, American asylums were created. Now, they were somewhat better, but still not great. They were usually filthy. They offered very little treatment, and individuals were often institutionalized for decades. Some treatments were things like submersion into cold baths for long periods of time. Electroshock treatment, which is now called electroconvulsive therapy, involving a brief application of electric stimulus to produce a generalized seizure. Now, conditions such as these were common until well into the 20th century. Now, in the 20th century, in 1954, antipsychotic medications were introduced. They proved successful in treating symptoms of psychosis. Psychosis was a common diagnosis evidenced by symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions, indicating a loss of contact with reality. So in 1954, everything was kind of like we were done with that. In 1975, Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act provided federal support and funding for community mental health centers. So an act of Congress called the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act provided federal support and funding for community mental health centers and started the process of deinstitutionalization. This was the closing of very large asylums by providing for people to stay in their communities and be treated locally. So this happened in 1975. Patients were released, but the new system was not set up effectively. Centers were underfunded, staff untrained to handle severe mental illnesses, which led to an increase in homelessness. For example, where I live in the town of Northampton, there used to be one of these mental asylums up on this place called Hospital Hill. Luckily, the building has been torn down. For a while, it was still there and vacant and empty, and it was kind of creepy and terrifying, to be honest with you. Now, oftentimes, we still experience quite a bit of homelessness in our city because of the result of this asylum closing in 1975. Now, mental health treatment today. Mental illness among the homeless population is still common today. Of the homeless individuals in the U.S. shelters, about 1/4 have a severe mental illness. Correctional institutions also report a high number of individuals living in mental illnesses. And mental health treatment today. Asylums have since been replaced with psychiatric hospitals and local community hospitals focused on short-term care. Actual hospitals, the same hospitals that you go to when you break your ankle, like I did, are the same hospitals that accept psychiatric patients. Due to high costs of psychiatric hospitalization, insurance coverage often limits length of time individuals can be hospitalized. So you might have them going in for what's called a 72-hour watch, or a 5150. Okay? Individuals are usually hospitalized if they are an imminent threat to themselves or others. And most people are not hospitalized but can still seek psychological treatment. Involuntary treatment, therapy that is not the individual's choice, e.g. weekly counseling sessions might be a condition of a parole, for example. Now, voluntary treatment is the person chooses to attend therapy to obtain relief from symptoms. And some of the sources of psychological treatment include community mental health centers, private or community practitioners, school counselors, school psychologists, or school social workers, group therapy. And treatment providers include psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical social workers, marriage and family therapists. And the types of treatments. Slide 14 is going to help you with questions 3 and 4. Questions 3 and 4 are asking you if you had to choose a type of treatment for someone with either PTSD or, what's the question? Borderline personality disorder. So you're treating someone with borderline personality disorder or PTSD. So borderline personality disorder is question 3, PTSD is question 4. Look to this chart to figure out what type of treatment would work best, given what you know about these two disorders. Try and steer clear of these top 2. Focus on these bottom 4, behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and humanistic therapy. Pick one of those 2. You can explain exactly what it would look like, give your argument for why it would work. And then the rest of this PowerPoint goes through each of those types of treatment. So you have psychoanalysis. This was the first form of psychotherapy developed by Freud in all of his weird, wildly ways in the early 20th century. And it aimed to help uncover repressed feelings. So he used some specific techniques like free association. The patient will relax and then say whatever comes to mind at the moment. Freud theorized that the ego would try to block unacceptable urges or painful conflicts during free association, causing the patient to demonstrate resistance. And he would focus on that. He would also use dream analysis. The therapist would interpret the underlying meaning of their dreams. And then also transference. Patient transfers all the positive or negative emotions associated with their other relationships to the psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis today is far less popular today, but Freud's perspective has been expanded upon by incorporating modern theories and methodology, which is what's created psychodynamic psychotherapy. This is talk therapy based on belief that the unconscious and childhood conflicts still do impact behavior, which could very well be true, but not used all that much. Psychoanalysis, this is the famous couch in Freud's consulting room. Patients were instructed to lie comfortably on the couch and to face away from Freud. He sat in the chair that you can kind of see back here. So they laid here with their head facing and looking in the opposite direction. Today, a psychotherapy patient is not likely to lie on a couch. Instead, he is more likely to sit facing the therapist in 2 chairs. The most common representation of the psychotherapist relationship, or the relationship between a counselor and a patient, is in many shows, including This Is Us, had a representation of it. If you were watched The Sopranos on HBO, it had a big representation of it. Now, play therapy is a psychoanalytical therapy wherein interaction with toys is used instead of talk and used in child therapy. This is used to help clients prevent/resolve psychosocial difficulties and achieve optimal growth. Some of the techniques include toys such as dolls, stuffed animals, and sandbox figurines are used to help children play out their hopes, fantasies, and traumas. Sand play or sand tray therapy. Children can set up a 3-dimensional world using various figures and objects that correspond to their inner state. The therapist observe how the child interacts with toys in order to understand the roots of the child's disturbed behavior, can be used to make a diagnosis. Non-directive play therapy, children are encouraged to work through problems by playing freely while therapists observe. Directive play therapy is when a therapist provides structure and guidance by suggesting topics, asking questions, and playing with a child. So they might say, can you draw me a photo of something that scares you? And the child may draw something that's a picture of something that represents their fears. You often see play therapy depicted on shows like Law & Order SVU when looking at and working with children of childhood trauma. Behavior therapy is when the principles of learning are applied to change undesirable behavior. So this is based on the belief that dysfunctional behaviors can be changed by teaching clients more constructive behaviors. So this is where you're actually using classical conditioning to change behavior. Conditioning principles are applied to recondition clients and change their behavior. Also, counter-conditioning. This is when the client learns a new response to a stimulus that has previously elicited an undesirable behavior. So this includes aversive conditioning or exposure therapy. Aversive conditioning uses an unpleasant stimulus to stop an undesirable behavior and is used to eliminate addictive behavior. So say a client is repeatedly exposed to something unpleasant, such as a mild electric shock or bad taste when they engage in a specific behavior. The client then learns to associate the unpleasant stimulus with the unwanted behavior. This is an example of this is antabuse. Antabuse is a substance that causes negative side effects such as vomiting when combined with alcohol. It has been used effectively to treat alcoholism. So if someone takes antabuse, who's an alcoholic, and then drinks alcohol because of the antabuse, it causes them to vomit uncontrollably, which makes them totally averse and not wanting to drink ever again. Exposure therapy seeks to change the response to a conditioned stimulus. This is used to treat fears or anxiety. A client is repeatedly exposed to the object or situation that causes their problem, with the idea that they will eventually get used to it over time. So you can see here, Mary Cover Jones developed the first type of exposure therapy, where an unconditioned stimulus is presented over and over just after the presentation of the conditioned stimulus. So in 1924, she aimed to replace Peter's fear of rabbits with a conditioned response of relaxation. So she would expose Peter to the rabbit, which is the conditioned stimulus. Then she would also expose Peter after that and separately to the unconditioned stimulus of some milk and cookies. And then she would repeatedly expose the milk and cookies at the same time as the rabbit while he was in a relaxed state. Then he became conditioned to respond to the rabbit the same way he would the cookies. He was able to pet the rabbit while eating his snack even. And Joseph Wolpe in 1958 refined Jones's techniques to develop a version of exposure therapy that's used today, known as systematic desensitization. This is a type of exposure therapy wherein a calm and pleasant state is gradually associated with increasing levels of anxiety-inducing stimuli. Fear and relaxation are incompatible. If client can relax around fear-inducing stimuli, the unwanted fear response will eventually be eliminated. The client is taught progressive relaxation, how to relax each muscle group to achieve a relaxed and comfortable state of mind. So someone practicing this will start from the tips of the toes and slowly relax each different body part to the top of the head. Progressive relaxation is used while client imagines anxiety-inducing situations. Over time, progressive relaxation helps the client become desensitized to the anxiety-inducing stimuli. And even more so, today, virtual reality exposure therapy uses a stimulation to help conquer fears when it's too impractical, expensive, or embarrassing to recreate anxiety-inducing situation. So that was classical conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is based on the principle that behaviors become extinguished when not reinforced. So this is where applied behavior analysis is used. This is an operant conditioning technique designed to reinforce positive behaviors and punish unwanted. This is effective in helping children with autism. Child-specific reinforcers, think stickers, praise, candy, are used to reward and motivate autistic children when they demonstrate desired behaviors. Punishment, things like timeout, might be used to discourage undesirable behaviors. And then token economy, used in controlled settings such as psychiatric hospitals. Individuals are reinforced for desired behaviors with tokens, think poker chips, that can be exchanged for items or privileges. Often used in psychiatric hospitals or even prisons to increase cooperation. Another way you see token economies used, but not quite in such a different environment, is in the home. Many of you might receive allowances for positive and good behavior that you can then use to buy things. Now, cognitive therapy was developed by Aaron Beck in the 1960s, based on the idea that how you think determines how you feel and act. Cognitive therapy focused on how thoughts lead to feelings of distress. So he was looking at emotional reactions as a result of your thoughts about a situation rather than the situation itself. This encourages clients to find a more logical way of interpreting situations and positive ways of thinking. Cognitive therapists help clients become aware of their cognitive distortions, thinking errors. So examples: overgeneralizing, taking a small situation and making it huge. Polarized thinking, this is black and white thinking, seeing things as absolutes. I am either perfect or a failure, which is oftentimes the cognition of those with depression. And jumping to conclusions, assuming that people are thinking negatively about you or reacting negatively to you without any evidence to the case. Clients are helped to change their dysfunctional thinking patterns by challenging their irrational beliefs, focusing on their illogical bases, and correcting them with more logical and rational thoughts and beliefs. So if you consistently interpret events and emotions around the themes of loss and defeat, then you are likely to be depressed. So if you fail a test, you might have an internal belief of, I'm worthless and stupid. This is going to lead to depression, as we covered in chapter 15. But a cognitive therapist is going to break down those internal beliefs and that irrational thinking so that when you fail a test, you have internal beliefs of, I'm smart, but I didn't study for this test, and I know I can do better, which is less likely to cause depression. From here, some therapists thought, okay, interesting. What if we combined those last two things and we had cognitive behavioral therapy? Unlike other forms of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy focuses more on present issues rather than a patient's past. So these are things like rational emotive therapy, one of the first forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, which was founded by Albert Ellis. And then you have cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, works to change cognitive distortions and self-defeating behaviors, and it aims to change both how people think and how they act. And it helps clients to examine how their thoughts affect their behavior. So it's a combination of cognitive therapy, making individuals aware of irrational negative thoughts and replacing them with positive ways of thinking, and behavioral therapies, teaches people to practice and engage in more positive, healthy approaches to situations. This uses the ABC model to reveal cognitive distortions, overgeneralizing, black and white thinking, jumping to conclusions. So it looks at action. Activating event, what's the activating event? B, belief about the event. What's your belief about the event? And C, consequences of the belief. Now that you have that belief, what's the consequences of that belief? Good, bad? From this then came humanistic therapy, which is focusing on helping people to achieve their potential. The goal is to increase self-awareness and acceptance through focus on conscious thoughts. This is where Rogerian and client-centered therapy came about. It was developed by Carl Rogers and emphasized the importance of the person taking control of his own life to overcome life's challenges. And there was a non-directive therapy. The therapist does not give advice or provide interpretations, but helps clients identify conflicts and understand feelings. When I was in my undergrad, we watched these films about this one patient. Her name was Gloria, and she experienced rational emotive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and humanistic therapy from Rogers himself. So you actually got to watch Rogers use the client-centered therapy approach. And this non-directive therapy where there was no advice being given. And Gloria got so aggravated by this process. She ends up smoking, getting so frustrated, she lights up a cigarette during the middle of the session because she's just really, really struggling with this. You're supposed to be here to give me advice and tell me what I need to do, and that's not what was happening. Gloria was being forced to identify conflicts and understand her feelings kind of on her own. and that made it very difficult. But they do this using active listening techniques where the therapist acknowledges, restates, and clarifies what the client's expressing. They also provide them with unconditional positive regard. They do not judge the clients. They simply accept them for who they are. And they provide genuineness, empathy, and acceptance towards their clients. So Rogers felt that therapists should demonstrate these because it helps the client become more accepting of themselves, which results in personal growth. Now, biomedical therapies. This is what's going to help you with questions 1 and 2. You have psychotropic medications, medications used to treat psychological disorders. Treat the symptoms of psychological disorders, but do not cure the disorder. Most of these biomedical therapies will help treat the symptoms, but will not treat the disease and cure it. It will never go away. It will merely help with the symptoms. You then have antipsychotics and atypical antipsychotics. This will help you with question 2 specifically. Antipsychotics treat positive psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia by blocking dopamine. Now you might be thinking, positive psychotic symptoms. What? How can something be positive? Positive meaning adds. These are additional symptoms that are added, not taken away. So when someone adds hallucinations into their daily lives, they have a positive psychotic symptom. An atypical antipsychotics treats the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, such as withdrawal and apathy, by targeting both dopamine and serotonin receptors. Antipsychotics and atypical antipsychotics both treat schizophrenia and other types of severe thought disorders. Now, so that antipsychotics and atypical antipsychotics will help you when it comes to question 2, but definitely look in section 16.1 in your book, or 16.2 in your book. Then antidepressants. These alter the levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. And this is what helps with depression and anxiety. Definitely look in the book to understand the different classifications, the SSRIs and the SNRIs, in section 16.2 in the book for question 1. Okay, so SSRIs and SNRIs. We want to talk about those two. Anti-anxiety agents depress central nervous system activation, so that will help with anxiety, OCD, PTSD, panic disorder, and social phobia. Mood stabilizers treat episodes of mania as well as depression, think bipolar disorder. Stimulants improve the ability to focus on a task and maintain attention, think ADHD. And electroconvulsive therapy includes seizures to help alleviate severe depression. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is magnets. Magnetic fields stimulate nerve cells to improve depression symptoms. Okay? So biomedical therapies, think pills, medication. Now, treatment modalities. Once an individual seeks treatment, therapists will arrange an intake, an initial meeting, to assess the client's clinical needs. The therapist gathers specific information to address the client's immediate needs. Presenting problem, the client support system, their insurance status. And then secondly, the therapist informs client about confidentiality, fees, and what to expect in treatment. Confidentiality. The therapist cannot disclose confidential communication to any third party unless mandated or permitted to do so by law. Treatment goals are discussed and a treatment plan is formed. So therapy may occur in a one-on-one between a therapist and client or in a group setting like we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. So individual therapy, a client works one-on-one with a trained therapist, and it usually lasts about 45 minutes to an hour, and meetings occur in a confidential environment. So in office, most of individual treatment modalities this past year during the pandemic have happened in some sort of virtual setting. Clients might explore feelings, work through life challenges, identify aspects of themselves and their lives that they wish to change, and set goals to work towards these changes. Now, group therapy is when several clients meet with a trained therapist to discuss a common issue such as divorce, grief, an eating disorder, substance abuse, or anger management, and can help decrease shame and isolation. Clients may have concerns about confidentiality or feel uncomfortable sharing problems with strangers. Psychoeducational groups are groups with a strong educational component. So think of a group for children whose parents have cancer, which teaches them about cancer. You also have family therapy. This aims to enhance growth of each family member as well as that of the family as a whole. The systems approach is when family is viewed as an organizational system, and each individual is a contributing member who creates and maintains processes within that system that shape behavior. Each member influences and is influenced by the others. One member usually has a problem that affects everyone, alcohol dependence, and the therapist helps them to cope with the issue. You then also have structural family therapy. This examines and discusses the boundaries and structure of the family. The therapist helps them to resolve issues and learn to communicate effectively. And strategic family therapy aims to address specific problems within the family that can be dealt with in a short amount of time. So, for example, for family therapy, I have a cousin who is a transsexual who was transitioning from female to male, and in order to do so successfully, family therapy had to occur so that they could approach what this would mean for the family structure. How would they process this change? Couples therapy is another treatment modality. Therapist helps people work on difficulties in their relationship, aims to help them resolve problems and implement strategies that will lead to a healthier and happier relationship. So how to listen, how to argue, and how to express feelings. And it's primarily using cognitive behavioral therapy in those particular therapy sessions. Now, addiction. Initially, individuals voluntarily choose to use a substance. Then, chronic substance use can permanently alter the neural structure in the prefrontal cortex associated with decision-making and judgment, which then leads the person to become driven to use drugs and alcohol, making it difficult to stop. Now, relapse, as we discovered in previous chapters, individuals returning to abusing a substance after a period of improvement, about 40 to 60% of individuals will relapse over time. In comorbid disorders with alcohol addiction or any form of addiction is things like individuals' addictions to drugs or alcohol have an additional psychological disorders. Substance abusers are twice as likely to have a mood or anxiety disorder. People with psychiatric disorders may self-medicate and abuse substances, and it's categorized as mentally ill and chemically addicted, and problems are often chronic and treatment has limited success. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health shows trends in prevalence of various drugs for ages 12 to 17, 18 to 25, and 26 and older. Oof. Now, substance-related treatment is often looked at very separately and very differently. The goal is to help an addicted person stop compulsive drug-seeking behaviors. It requires long-term treatment, more cost-effective than incarceration or not treating those with addiction. Substance use and abuse cost the United States over $600 billion a year. And behavior therapy can help motivate the addicted to participate in the treatment program and teach strategies for dealing with cravings and how to prevent relapse. Now, medication uses to detox the addict safely after an overdose, to prevent seizures and agitation that often occur in detox, and to prevent reuse of the drug, and to manage withdrawal symptoms. That's the only time medication is used when it comes to substance-related disorders. So there's not a lot of people love using biomedical techniques, therapies, when it comes to substance-related treatment. Now, what makes treatment effective is the duration of the treatment. At least 3 months is usually needed to achieve a positive outcome. The treatment must also be holistic, addresses multiple needs, not just the drug addiction, due to psychological, physiological, behavioral, and social aspects of abuse. It addresses stress management, communication, relationship issues, parenting, vocational concerns, and legal concerns. In group therapy, addicts are more likely to maintain sobriety in a group format due to the rewarding and therapeutic benefits of the group, such as support, affiliation, identification, and even confrontation. Think Alcoholics Anonymous and the success rate that those areas have had. And parental involvement, correlated with greater reduction in use by teen substance abusers. So if parents are involved in their treatment, then they're more likely to be successful. Now we want to look at the sociocultural model. This perspective looks at you, your behaviors, and symptoms in the context of your cultural and background. How do your culture and religious beliefs affect your attitude toward mental health treatment? It can be extreme. Quite a few of the students at Westfield State struggled during the pandemic to seek help and treatment for mental health issues while they were home. Many of their parents didn't believe that they should be seeking treatment, believing that the old adage that mental health doesn't exist, you're just choosing to be depressed, is oftentimes what my father would say. I had to educate him fully that that's not actually the case. Cultural competence is the mental health professionals most understand and address issues of race, culture, and ethnicities, and use strategies to effectively address needs of various populations. So multicultural counseling and therapy integrates the impact of cultural and social norms, aims to work with clients and define goals consistent with their life experiences and cultural values. They also strive to recognize clients' identities to include individual, group, and universal dimensions, advocates the use of universal and cultural specific strategies and roles in the healing process, and balances the importance of individualism and collectivism in the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of clients. So when we learned about individualistic and collectivistic cultures earlier on in the semester, that is incorporated into the therapeutic model. What kind of culture do you come from in order to assess and diagnose and treat? And then lastly, what are some treatment barriers? Access and availability of mental health services, lack of insurance, transportation, and time. Even when access is comparable among racial and ethnic groups, minorities utilize mental health services less than white middle-class Americans. You also have ethical disparities, lack of bilingual treatment. It's important that many of our mental health counselors be bilingual. Many people can communicate better in their native language, and they can talk about their symptoms better when being able to communicate in their native language. Makes it difficult for a therapist to actually diagnose if they're not understanding their client's symptoms. Stigma around mental health, right? Like I mentioned, there's a lot of stigma around mental health. The reason women might have more prevalence in many of the disorders talked about in chapter 15 could be because there are men walking around out there with a stigma that they're not allowed to have these mental health disorders. So they're not disclosing it. They're not being diagnosed. So we don't know. The fear of not being understood, family privacy, and lack of education on mental illness. Perceptions and attitudes is another treatment barrier. Self-sufficiency and not seeing the need for help. I can do it. I can get through anything. Not seeing therapy as effective, and concerns about confidentiality. And also the fear of psychiatric hospitalization or treatment itself. What if I'm so crazy I have to go away and get locked up? It becomes a treatment barrier. I hope you've enjoyed this semester. I know that I have enjoyed teaching all of you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. nwest@westfield.ma.edu.